the things that Pete and others talked about is one conclusion, sort of starting point for this is when we work with European projects, we tend to start with rhetorics. There are so many words that are appropriated by people for different purposes. What we wanted to do in Work Package 2 is actually get down to the very basics of interpersonal relationships, communication, nomenclature, from the perspective of the stakeholders involved. And I think this is where we actually found a lot of the interesting stuff of when co-creation is actually happening at the micro level. Did you find mine? Yeah, you can take number 2. So what we did then, we did the focus groups, and it ended, we summarized this in a report published on May 1st, 2017, Probable Hindrance Co-creation in SSA. Experiences, considerations, lessons learned. And we identified, on the basis of the different discussions, a set of less or very important recommendations, and I will come back to that in a minute. Then Peter and I, we did, my co-worker Peter Dorbus and I, we did follow-up interviews with the consortium PIs to see if they have additional information, reflections, or inputs to the recommendations and the findings we found in the first part of the study. So, my impression as a sociologist is that it all comes down to the nitty-gritty parts of the nuts and bolts of working together. In that sense, this is nothing new, but we need to keep reminding ourselves about the fact that we do speak different languages. National languages and professional languages, and this is supported by all the focus group interviews we had. This is what you talked about in the interviews. You talked about the need for allocating enough time, money, and human resources for co-creation. If we don't allocate, designate money and people, nothing tends to happen. Of course, you have a lot of people that are really committed anyway, devoted to these questions. But in order to make it more systematic, I think Peter was touching upon this subject, you need to have people that have a clear chance to actually do something. Goes for any part of the quadruple helix. From the onset, involve all the stakeholders in defining a common area of concern. What we notice is when we talk about a problem, we mean different things. The problem is that we don't even agree what the problem is, or what the term problem means. In social work, a social problem is not necessarily a scientific problem. And a scientific problem is not necessarily a problem for industry. And I think this is what you also support with the way you reason in the focus groups. You give a lot of good examples of this, where it works and doesn't work. So to speak, the accomplish, that's the new term, when it doesn't work, what we don't accomplish. So that's for the Accomplish 2.0, we already have an acronym. Address differences in institutional logics, rationale, incentives, and roles. We have to respect and understand that we enter a relationship of co-creation and impact-driven research with different roles. You need to spend some time on defining the roles and being clear about what your obligations in your respective work is. Going back to social work, a social worker is not a scientist, and a scientist is not a social worker, and I think it's good that way. But we need to be clear that we have different roles and obligations in this relationship. Talk about language, nomenclature, and communication. Actually communicate about communication. There are so many examples also within academia. I think some of the things you say here apply to academia. We don't even have to go outside. It's enough with me talking to people in the technical sciences or with the university administration. So in that sense, we're just as diverse within academia as we are in terms of differences between academia and other parts of the credible fields. Nuria mentioned this too. Challenge your own frame of mind, the way you think. I think what we tend to forget is that there is a counter-movement in academia. It's easy that we talk about the importance of co-creation because we're already here. We're already part of the Sagrada Familia. Right? We already like this, but a lot of the researchers I meet are very suspicious. They talk about the fact that we are eroding their scientific integrity. And we, as their colleagues, have an obligation and a chance to actually explain to them what co-creation and impact-driven research is and is not. I spend a lot of time talking about what it isn't, rather than what it actually is. And this is supported by the focus group interviews too. You mentioned these sort of examples. You mentioned this to provide spaces for interaction, physical space, cafes, science research, science cafes, but also meetings, platforms. You can use sort of web-based spaces for communication. And I think this is something we'll probably talk about on Friday too. What do we do with a platform like ACCOMPLISH? But as we move into the future, how can we use this platform for further co-creation and impact-driven research? These were more or less the recommendations based on the focus groups, and as you may have understood, I added some personal reflections to this, but I think this is the place to do it. And I also think that I agree with Peter's view of how these things have changed over time. The co-creation and impact-driven research is much more sort of, we can take more for granted today, and this really hooks into the wider, European-wider discussion on open science and open to the world. And I think this is also where we actually serve as a good example of how you can do this. And I like to remind ourselves that we need to relate this to the discussion, the 3 O's by Carlos Moedas, although it's, in a sense, with rhetorics, I think we can all agree that open science is important. Science with and for society. So, if you have any questions, I'll be here, and you can also ask me now. Thank you very much.